Cáilte fáilte. Welcome to today's talk, #MeToo, Changing Minds, Changing Cultures, by Noeline Blackwell, which is part of this year's special online virtual Féile, brought to you by Féile on Phobail in partnership with St Mary's University College and the Irish News. Noeline is Chief Executive of the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre and a human rights lawyer. So Noeline, I'm going to hand over to you and thank you very much for joining us for this year's Féile.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and I'm delighted to be with you, although it would have been much nicer to have been at Féile in Belfast, but there you are. That's how our world has changed over the course of a few months. And that then kind of leads me straight into my talk, because I'm talking about something that happened 3 years ago, which, you know, often would just seem like a flash of time, but now it nearly seems like another era of pre-COVID. But in 2017, when Alyssa Milano, an American actor, spoke out about sexual harassment in the entertainment industry in Hollywood, she set in being a movement which has ramifications right to this time, and I think we'll have into the future, and is therefore worth concentrating on. Alyssa Milano was not the first person to say Me Too in the context of sexual violence. That honour goes to Tarana Burke, an activist against sexual violence and domestic violence in the States as well, who coined it as a phrase in 2006 to allow people who had been victims of domestic and sexual violence that she was dealing with as a community activist to hear each other and to understand each other. When Alyssa Milano said it in 2017, suggesting that the hashtag be used before the word Me Too and that it go on social media, she too wanted to use it as an empowerment and a way of recognizing something that she had experienced and that she thought other people had as well. It was a time where the New York Times and the New Yorker was also coming out with what they were reporting about Harvey Weinstein. But when she said it, I doubt very much she could have expected that people stopped counting at about 2 million people who came out and said Me Too. And it was a way of allowing people as a collective, as a community, to identify with other people in relation to what was only whispered before, and which was either whispered or totally silenced. It therefore followed that in that year, Time magazine, about which we might or might not agree that it's a great magazine, but they made Alyssa Milano, Tarana Burke, and some of the other women who had spoken out, they called them the silence breakers. And the reason I think it's important we talk about them still, and we talk about Me Too still, is the fact that the silence that still occurs around sexual violence and domestic violence is a cancer in our society. In fact, our new programme for government in the Republic of Ireland has named it an epidemic, or maybe it's just endemic in our society, which or whether it is there, it's the whole way through our society at all levels. And it is slowing us down as a society. It makes us unhealthy, it makes us less productive, and it means we are, above all, less equal. So that movement in 2017, at a time when I was not working that long in the Rape Crisis Centre, made me think a lot about what it was that didn't allow people to speak out. And then last year in 2019, Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, the first rape crisis centre in Ireland, but which had been established with the help of a similar movement that was going on in Belfast at the time, a Belfast Rape Crisis Centre. But we had our 40th anniversary conference in 2019. And we brought back some of the people who had been there at the start and asked them to tell us about their experience. And they did. And none of them spoke about it as a happy time. The whole energy around setting up a rape crisis centre had come from women who had been out on these Reclaim the Night marches in the 1970s. They were reclaiming the night because they felt they should have the right to walk where they want, to associate with whom they want, to wear what they want, without being at huge risk, greater risk than men, of physical and sexual assault. So that was a massively energetic time. But by the time the Rape Crisis Centre was being set up, there was a retrenchment, a pulling back, a silencing of people. So it took these extraordinarily committed people like Anne O'Donnell, Evelyn Conlon, Barbara Egan, and Olive Braden. I name them because they were the people on our panel, and their role in keeping up or in bringing together a safe space for people who were subject to rape or sexual abuse, in setting up a helpline for them, cannot be underestimated. At a time where they spoke about the fact they could not talk about it publicly. If they were interviewed, they did not give their names. Many of them were asked by their families and friends not to say where they worked or to talk about it in some way. That, we have come further than that. We are not in that place today. But I was terribly struck within weeks of the Me Too movement starting by the fact that we were actually being asked already. I was being asked, did I not think that the Me Too movement had gone too far, that where was the right to due process for people, where was the justice for people who were accused? And so that really, what I suppose is the nub of my talk here today. Why is it that we have a system whereby to this day people feel, correctly I think, that it is not easy for them to speak out, that they are not able to name a wrong and an injustice and a harm that is done to them? Okay, we don't have equal pay between men and women, but women are much more conscious of equal pay, and nobody considers it a matter for shame if they say that they're not getting equal pay for equal work. We have ways in which women have advanced to a point where they can name injustices that still happen. We have ways in which people who are discriminated against on all grounds feel they have ways that they can name it without feeling that they're shaming anyone. In the area of intimate violence, in the area of sexual violence and domestic violence, those who speak out still need an extraordinary amount of bravery. They are extraordinary advocates for justice, those who speak out and who speak truth to power. You have to focus on them. When we focus on them as a society, we tend to focus on how disruptive they're being. What have they done? How did they attract somebody to create that kind of violence, to do that kind of violence to them? How did they precipitate it themselves? Why are they speaking out when that is so disruptive for our system? They should be ashamed of themselves, and very often they are. This is the truth about sexual violence. Very often, the people who are victims of it themselves feel that they brought it on themselves, that they are to blame. It is not gender specific. No, it isn't. It affects people of all genders. It affects people at all levels in society. Nonetheless, and this is a truth as far as we know it from all the evidence, it is predominantly a harm and a crime that is inflicted on women, and it can impact on them disproportionately as well. So, you know, you have a system where we have at the moment, and I'm rather taken by two cases that we had recently on the phone. We were on the National 24-hour helpline, and there was the person who'd had to retire early from work because of sexual harassment that she could not speak about. So she's retired on a lower pension. So it's not only just about the trauma to the dignity of the person, it's the fact that that woman is in a lower economic position. There are regularly the students who say, I can't go back to that college, I can't complete my degree there. So the economic impact of that. So there's so many impacts across our systems. And actually, I think that's what the problem is. The problem is that for less than 200 years ago, women, children, and lunatics were all considered in the same category in law because they were all considered to be impaired in some ways. To this day, those who have mental illness, those who are under 18 or of minor age, and women continue to have to try to adjust the stereotypes that would label them as imperfect and inferior in some ways. Because once you have that label, then somebody else is more powerful, is more superior to you, and therefore has that sense of entitlement. So just for this moment, my focus is on sexual violence, but not for a moment do I think that it is not worse for people with multiple discriminations. And if I ever needed anything to tell me about that, it is the case in our courts in June 2020, where James O'Reilly was eventually sentenced to 20 years in prison after horrific abuse of his younger sister and 7 daughters over a 23-year period. And for those women, they had to confront a society which thinks of the family normally as a safe space, but which thinks of travellers very often as not to be really believed, and things expected from them that, you wouldn't accept in a different society. So these women, children of a traveller women themselves, and children of a traveller man, felt that they had nowhere to say, how they found the courage and the words to speak out into a community which did not talk about rape or sexual violence. This is what they said, this is reported, into a society which they say could it have caught them earlier if they hadn't been travellers, and then having to speak out again, to speak about their father in that kind of way. So they are extremely brave, all of those. But they speak into a system and into a culture. They and everybody who speaks out against sexual violence speak into systems and cultures that just don't work to fix the problem we have right now. And anywhere that you need reform, you see, reform is needed at 2 levels. It's needed at levels of reforming structures and reforming a culture. So if we look at the structures that we have used to interrogate sexual violence of all sorts, including what the Me Too movement were speaking out about, were adjustments of structures that were founded by the powerful and those who were respectable and expected to be believed and were not held to account for this kind of violence. So our court system is entirely unfit to hear this kind of case, which so often depends on the credibility of the 2 parties involved. Sir John Gillen in Northern Ireland has published a report, and in some ways the most striking thing that he said when he was publishing his report was he had spent many years as a prosecuting counsel, as a defence counsel, at the most senior levels, and as a judge. And he was shocked by what he heard from victims, which he was asked, whom he met as part of his investigation. He simply did not know that was happening. Now, in what other areas do you try to fix structures without hearing the voice of people? In fairness to John Gillen, he heard the voices of the victims, and that is reflected in the many, many recommendations that he has made for adjustment of our court system. In the employment area, which is very often where sexual harassment will come up, we have systems whereby it's kind of, you have to meet a checklist, and there are systems in place, and somebody can report sexual harassment or abuse in the workplace. But anecdotally, we have to live with anecdote because we don't have the data on it. Those who report sexual harassment in the workplace are often seen as the disruptor. A person reporting such will not be believed unless there are several other incidents coming in from other people about the same person who is noted as the person carrying out the abuse and the harassment. So in our systems, very often you are simply disrupting the structure and the system when you report sexual harassment. And very often people will not do it, because what could happen at the end is, even if they are vindicated, they are going to be seen as a troublemaker. At best, they mightn't get the promotions and the advantages that they would otherwise expect. And at worst, somebody might be working to let them go. So that is also typical of people who are unequal, who are speaking truth to power. People will very often sensibly make a calculation of what is safe and not safe for them to say. And they will very often self-censor in a way that keeps them safe, but does absolutely nothing to protect the greater society or to move it forward. Which is why Me Too is in some ways forcing a new energy on our structures, because Me Too wasn't just at one occasion. Every so often, we are seeing, well, first of all, we're seeing enough scandals by people in authority and people with great privilege who abused power to abuse minors and adults. But in addition to that, we are also seeing from time to time that social media, for all of its evils and for all the harm that it too can do, it sometimes is giving an energy to allowing our people, our society, to get around the structures which have failed to identify the inequalities that actually target the person reporting the harm rather than the person carrying out the harm. And so that's at the level of our systems. At the level of our culture, we have, as a society, an awful lot of work to do. It is almost a cliche that when somebody reports a rape, the questions that they get asked are, how much did you have to drink? What were you wearing? Why did you go there? You must have known when you were going on that holiday you were going to get yourself into that situation. And worst of all, what did you do to provoke the other person? So these are the kind of things that we have, that we ask. And even if we get past that stage, we are still dealing with centuries where women, children and lunatics were banded together in this group, where the only way very often a woman could guarantee her economic well-being, the well-being for her children, was by recognizing that sense of entitlement in her husband, to the extent that in a case in Ireland in the 1970s, around the time of the Reclaim the Night marches, around that time, a judge correctly stated the law in a particular case as saying that a wife was a chattel, just like a cow or a thoroughbred horse. That was less than 50 years ago. It is only 30 years ago in these islands that rape was recognized within marriage. Before that, a husband could not in law rape his wife. So we have come an awfully long way in so many recognitions of equality of men and women. We have a much more nuanced understanding of gender than we did a while ago. We have a recognition of same-sex relationships that over time is bound to change how we feel about entitlement. But what we haven't addressed is a culture where we're not actually crying about the inequality and the capacity to abuse. We still tolerate abusers. We still say, that's a very respectable person. Surely you're not going to put his reputation at risk by doing this. Occasionally hers, I agree, but for the most part, it tends to be this person has a great reputation, a great future. So can we leave aside the fact that that this complaint is being made against them? Surely you are not going to go to a point where you drive that person into a less fulfilling future. Now, where I'd like us to go next, and this is going to be problematic though, is how do we get over the fact that this sense of entitlement has been so pervasive for centuries that when you start to have a conversation, and I guess on foot of my talk here today, when I finish this statement of what I am seeing, I feel there will be a lot of people who will go, look, you're never going to get anywhere if you're attacking men. I hope I'm not attacking men. I hope I'm attacking abuse and inequality where it stands. But I see the problem. I see the problem that if you are brought up in a situation where you have entitlement, I see that where you are, you think this is a way to go, and you've never had to question. You've never had to look to see, is the other person who is my equal, an equal human being, are they as content about this way of behaving as I am? We've never had to have that conversation in relation to sexual behavior and sexual activity. We have had to have it in relation to the workplace. There are still, there's so many areas in which in the workplace, women still get paid less than men, have a different kind of job. And indeed, if women start to overtake men in a particular role, very often that is downgraded. But that's less the case. And women are now working in all kinds of areas that 50 years ago would have seemed inconceivable. But 50 years ago, maybe a little bit more, it wasn't on for a respectable wife to have to go out to work because her husband would be able to support her. So, we've actually come quite a distance in that area. How can we speed up that process and bring ourselves forward to just say, first of all, do we recognize that in fact, sexual abuse is a deeply harmful and traumatic experience that can damage a person for their whole lives? If somebody needs proof around that, there's lots of proof out there. There is a lot of proof that by attacking somebody in their most intimate dignity, that you can do terrible damage. There is also a need for people to be able to say, I was that person who was harmed and I need to get help. And there needs to be systems in our society that allow people to get help so that they can understand whatever harm was done to them and come to terms with it. That in itself can help heal. Right now, we very often expect people to go and to take all the actions to complain abuse at a time when they're hurting very badly themselves. We would never expect somebody in a car crash to get out and first of all complain to the police about the harm done without getting the treatment that they need for themselves first. So how we move from where we are now, which is a recognition, I think, at a great level, that an awful lot of people have suffered abuse in the area of sexual behavior and sexual activity and haven't been able to talk about it. How do we make our systems better? How do we identify ways in which the person who claims that isn't the person who's seen as the problem? And again, going back to the courts in Northern Ireland, the Gillen report is to be implemented more fully now. That's very welcome. Down south, we're still waiting for our report to issue, but we have hope that it will actually allow us to move into a different phase where the person making the complaint isn't seen as the disruptor and the problem. But then we have to do the other bit as well. For each of us, for any of us who have family members, we have to, I think, say we will not tolerate that kind of disrespectful behavior any longer or at all. And we will teach our children, the children we teach as teachers, we will teach our children in our own families, and our youngsters, our young adults. We will teach them that they are a generation that know or ought to know that every human being is born equal in freedom and in dignity, and that they should be recognized as such, and that therefore the only way in which sexual behavior and sexual activity should take place is on a fully consensual basis. And then we need to work with the rest of us as well to say, what would our lives be like if we did not have this curse, this scourge of sexual violence, and to recognize it would be better. And then once we know that, then I think the systems in our workplaces, the systems for those who work freelance in the theatre industry, in the legal industry, in journalism, all of these would be better because abuse would simply not be tolerated. We have ended corporal punishment for the most part of children. We've certainly ended corporal punishment of adults as a recognized form of discipline. It's not. It is a human rights abuse. Sexual violence is also a human rights abuse. Me Too, not perfect, not working as well as it should because of the lack of safe systems into which to report. Me Too is probably here to stay in one form or another because there's enough people working outside the system who won't allow it to go away. And so therefore, can the rest of us get on board and identify what is it we could do to make it unnecessary for people to call out Me Too in the numbers in which they now call out, with the hurt with which they now call out, and make our society a healthier, safer, and ultimately more equal place.